Good morning, everyone. We start with our 10th technical session titled Why Africa Matters. The session is chaired by Professor Ajay Dubey. He's a professor at the Center for African Studies. Professor Dubey specializes in diaspora studies, Indian migration, and Indo-African relations. His areas of interest are international relations, African affairs, development issues, and political science, among other different centers and institutes he has chaired. The last one was he has chaired Center for National Security Studies. Thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure to join all of you. Professor Preeti Singh, the entire team which is here, excellencies, colleagues from different centers, students. Why international relation matters and why Africa matters in this. You will hear today an African perspective on that. So long we don't have one world government. We have states divided within the geographical territory and they are sovereign. And they are mandated to do the best for their country, for their people. We see that how they maximize their interest, not just within the boundary, but outside. And therefore, so long the world remains divided into different countries, the international relations among those states are going to matter. It has mattered in the past. It is still an important matter for the present. Africa, which is a region which has seen the maximum impact of international forces, reach out, suppressions, exploitations, and also some overtures from a country like India for South-South friendship. We see today, you heard today that, yesterday that Trump is trying to, please come. Trump is now trying to see that how South Africa internal matter of distributing the land as a resource to those whose lands were taken during apartheid period is not being allowed, and the United States has withdrawn its aid. We have seen how West Africa is suffering from so many international forces, not just the colonial forces, but also terrorism, which is across the globe. And it is from this perspective that why Africa matters in the international relation and how international relation matters for Africa has been also captured by several African scholars by proposing some theoretical framework for that. I won't take much time to begin with. Maybe I'll come back a bit later. But let us hear from our colleague, Professor Jamal Moosa, who is an Africanist for so many years on these issues, that how international relations matter for Africa and how Africa matters for international relations. Over to you for 35 minutes.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair. At the onset, I'd like to thank the Dean and the team for Preeti and others for organizing and giving me this opportunity on why Africa matters in this current year's Kunzru Memorial Lectures. And I'm also thankful to the Chair. And he's been a mentor for a long time and for almost 3 decades. So then, thank you for being that. And I'm also thankful to all the guests, chairpersons, and colleagues, and His Excellency Ambassador from Angola for being present today. Now, we are living in a world, and I think I would like to start my presentation with that we are in a post-COVID world which has been disrupted. And this disruption was very significant, and it impacted, and we know how it impacted. I would not spend too much time on that, but just want to flag the fact that despite the disruptions caused by COVID, the continent, African continent, came out comparatively less, disrupted and scat. So that's one very important thing that we must keep in mind, that Africa and the continent as a continent has been able to weather the COVID disruptions fairly effectively and significantly. And other than that, there are these global challenges that we are experiencing in the form of climate change, where the consequences of climate change will be far more significant on agrarian-based societies like African societies. So there is going to be far more, disproportionate impact on Africa of severe weather changes, and there are going to be consequences, and that also has to be factored when we think about Africa. Then the current European wars are economic contestations between China, US, and then lastly the fact that we are, as Professor Dubey pointed out correctly, that we are in Trump era, and there are consequences of that to the whole international system, and Africa also will experience consequences of that. With that as a background, and I would like to emphasize on one thing, is that Africa is very important in terms of the fact that not only because it is the second largest continent and has around 1/5 of the world's land area, that it has around 18 to 20% of the world population and 55 odd countries. So this itself in the larger international system is substantial, far too large. It's going to have bearing on the international system, which can't be ignored. But more importantly, when I think this is something that we must keep in mind, is that median age in Africa is 19.2 or something like that, in comparison to the global average of 30.6. And if you see that 20% of the population of Africa, the world population, is at 19 average, the global 30. So you can imagine what is the general average age of non-African, median age in the non-African population of the world. That is important. We are having an era of we will be having a large young population from Africa. Apart from that, Africa hosts enormous amount of biodiversity, which has future potential for solutions to the challenges that mankind experiences. So these biodiversities, hotspots, have to be secured and safe. So this is one part of it. Other than that, Africa has abundant resources, natural resources, mineral resources, oil, gas, different types of minerals, cobalt, uranium, you name it. The idea is that it has a significantly large number of these resources which matter to a large number of economies, societies. So the absence of these or disruption in these will also have a point. So that's one thing. Also, countries like India have enormous challenges in managing our food security concerns. Africa has a significantly large amount of arable land, though it does not produce as efficiently and as significantly. So for example, we have around 20 or 1/5 of the world population. Our food security in terms of pulses, spices, cereals, all this is also linked to the production and and the bearing of how effectively or efficiently African economies produce would also have bearing on our food security. So that's one thing. But all this adds up to what has always been called as the resource curse, that Africa has, and many African societies, because they are so well endowed with natural resources, and there are people desirous of having access and control over these natural resources, invariably many African states have suffered consequences of contestation to have control over these resources. So this is one big challenge which many African states, the external desire for extraterritorial powers to have access and control over these resources, has also led to undermining these states and countries. Even then, some of the fastest growing economies are in Africa. I was just saying today morning, Carnegie has reported that out of the top 20 fastest growing economies in 2024, 9 of them are from Africa. Surprisingly, Niger, Senegal, Libya, Rwanda, Ivory Coast, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Gambia, and Benin. And Niger is an interesting case because Niger produces a large amount of uranium, and we have seen that there is this contestation of the colonial dominance of France being undermined and being, eventually is being undermined and unraveling. And this is globally the third fastest growing economy, according to Carnegie. So this we have to keep in mind. Second thing, Africa is significantly important in terms of the fact that almost all major powers and middle powers have engaged Africa and African, continentally through institutional mechanisms. So they have established periodic institutional mechanisms through which the continent engages with them. You had the Franks used to do this with Francophonie, then it expanded to the whole continent. You have EU-AU engagement. You have FUCOC, and the last one was in 24. You have TICAD, which is expected in August this year, once in 3 years. And then US African Leader Summit also took place in end of 2022. And Turkey, South Korea, a host of other countries have also been actively developing and establishing institutional mechanisms to engage with Africa. So this is the importance of it. And recently, during the India's President G20, we were able to successfully bring in Africa as a permanent, AU as a permanent, member in the G20. So that means that there is, globally, there is a feeling and a necessity, an effort to engage with Africa because it matters, because it is important, and because it holds enormous potential for the future. So global powers and have also been engaging with Africa. Surprisingly, I found out that in the financial year 2023, UAE was the largest, developmental partner and investor in Africa with almost $110 billion investments. So it's not just countries like that. In this, we unfortunately have not been able to hold the India-Africa Forum Summit for some time, almost 9 odd years. So that's one aberration that exists. But otherwise, all major powers have actively engaged through institutional means and have engaged with Africa. Not to say India is also actively engaging it through other, not necessarily through standardized institutional means, but through other means, through visits and through other forms. Now, so this reflects the global changing perception of Africa. That in May, The Economist called Africa the hopeless continent. This famous cover page of May 2000 of The Economist, which showed that it's a hopeless continent. Now they changed their opinion somewhere down the line, and in October 2008, they said it is a continent of hope. So within a span of 8 years, a continent which was seen as hopeless, publicly proclaimed to be hopeless, suddenly became the continent of hope. And then 2011 December, they said it is a rising continent, Africa rising. So there is this dramatic change of perception within a decade. And there are reasons for this. So I'll come back to this later. But the fact is that in the public memory, public imagination, if you ask what Africa constitutes, we invariably find that it is a continent which is marginalized. It does not have its due in the international arena. It doesn't have its space in the international arena. The heft that it should carry is lacking, though it doesn't stop it from asserting or at least, emphasizing that it exists. So during the Ukraine-Russian war, they sent a delegation of AU, sent a large delegation to both the warring parties asking that the disruption caused by the war has consequences on them. So it would be nice if they would not, and the war would end. So the point is that Africa does not or is not having the due which it should in terms of the potential, in terms of the capacity, in terms of the other factors involved. So why is it so? I mean, if we need to look back to much more deeper, as Professor Dubey was correctly pointing out, that people do matter. People matter, and people's lives matter, and people's lives are organized by state. So states matter. So in an international system, in an international system of states, a system of states, states do matter, and so we need to deconstruct or we need to interrogate the African state itself. Now, the Africans were forcibly incorporated into the international economic order, international economic system, the then prevailing international economic system during the colonial period by colonial powers. So that's one fact, that Africans did not have the luxury of engaging with the international system in a manner in which it was suitable or beneficial to them. They were forcibly in. And immediately after that, there was an era of what was called as Atlantic slave trade. Almost 10% significant portion of African population was disrupted, was on the, societies were disrupted because of slaving right through Central West Africa and large parts of Africa. So Atlantic slave trade. And then 1884, Berlin Conference. The fate of the continent was decided by people sitting across table in Berlin in 1884 and distributing the continent into zones of, for control and privilege and to exploit. So this led to what was called as the scramble for Africa. So this is very important, that the way in which African states were incorporated, African societies were incorporated, and since I must add that whole continent is not a homogeneous continent, there are variations. Northern African states are very different in terms of their history, their establishment and the way they have functioned and their engagement with the larger system, and Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Africa have all variations. So we must keep those in mind. But broadly, the Berlin Conference decided on the borders of African states, which were not natural, which were not based on the ground realities. And this led to fragmented societies, fragmented tribes or groups. And this all led to Africa having a perpetual crisis and perpetual, challenge which it even faces till today. Then the pacification or physical establishment on control on the continent took a long time, because people, as I said, refused to be bowed down by what was decided in Berlin, and they resisted, and these resistances persisted for a very long period of time. Eventually, nationalist movements started in Africa, and during the Cold War, after the Second World War, and within a short period of time, the international system underwent a change. The post-World War world was a world of Cold War, superpower rivalry, and it was in this that many African states got their independence. And this independence also has been, in some places, very short. Some places it had to be fought through a long armed struggle, like in some of the Portuguese colonies, then all the Portuguese colonies, then Algeria. So apart from that, and in South Africa, apart from that, you have to, so the national struggle also has a bearing on the post-colonial states. The contemporary state has its roots in the brutal, authoritarian, colonial, exploitative states. So that states with artificial boundaries has persisted. The colonial decolonization, especially in Francophone Africa, was a misnomer in many ways because most of the countries voluntarily were duressed into giving their fiscal independence. So they had political independence, but they did not have fiscal. So they remained a part of the CFA zone, franc zone, and the economies were tied to European, France's economy, access to French, market access to French and French products, and so there was a period of French domination. That is now appearing to unravel. That is one of the major changes that has happened in the last few years. The next issue is that during Cold War, many African states could survive by playing out the Cold War dynamics themselves. So you would invariably have regimes which were not necessarily popular, regimes which were supported and propped up by Cold War rivals. So each of them would, have their proxy states or continue to, give them space, control, and opportunity. So that is the one challenge that was there. Now, post-Cold War period is a very interesting period in terms of how African states have the Cold War dynamics meant there were end of the Cold War dynamics in 90s meant that there was this is also called the lost decade. A large number of countries withdrew, both the superpowers, since one was no longer existed, the other superpower withdrew from Africa. Its initial efforts at, global policekeeping and all in Somalia backfired. So after that, the continent was left to its devices, and the continent was able to appears it was enormous reorganizing because there was the change in the international system also had a bearing. The fall of the Berlin Wall, German reunification, genocide in Yugoslavia, a crisis in Europe. So for the first time, the attention of the West was diverted, and Africa had a little bit elbow room and space to, and it was in this period that also many internal stresses got released. So we had a genocide in Rwanda, Burundi, and there was many other African countries imploded. There was a lot of violence, a lot of crisis, refugee problems. All this also eventually led to the formation of the creation of the AU from OAU. OAU had been established with the premise that it had two basic compromises. One, it will not interfere in the internal dynamics and internal issues of a society, of countries, and largely focus on getting self-determination for the remaining countries and end apartheid. The second was that colonial boundaries would be sacrosanct. The acceptance of the colonial boundaries of Berlin by OAU as a compromise for bringing towards both the Monrovia and the Casablanca group, to bringing in both these groups was important because it has had consequences even till today. We have, for example, SADR and Morocco are still fighting a struggle for their own recognition, primarily based on colonial boundaries of Spanish Sahara and French Morocco. So this has been there. And there are other places also. So there are only rare instances where these boundaries were allowed to be redrawn. One of them was South Sudan. And South Sudan was allowed to secede. But otherwise, the continent has refrained from redrawing the boundaries. Even when Somalia did not have an effective government, it was not encroached by its neighbors. So that is very important that we must keep in mind. No, but then the point is that why should you create a new organization with the same membership? OAU and AU have the same membership. The reason is that the agenda for OAU was self-determination, achieving independence. But once that had been achieved, there was a feeling that there must be a newer agenda. So AU came with a far more aggressive, far more reform, or far more intrusive agenda of looking at various internal issues, inclusiveness, governance, and so on and so forth. So this was one major change that was felt. And the continent has undergone and has been able to, or has incorporated various, what do you call, programs, like recently you have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and there have been series of these continental bodies, continental regional bodies which emerged. Now there is a dichotomy in terms that, and this is the challenge, that the state in Africa, it has been argued, were basically the continuation of the colonial state with only the symbolic change of the top man, the big man. The leaders changed, but the structure, the functioning, the reality of the state consisted and persisted. So you just had notional changes, and the reality remained that they were all, as some people have argued, gatekeeper states, where states controlled resources, and those who controlled resources then sold those resources to, acted as gatekeepers and allowing people to have access and charging them for having access. So, but the continent has created enormously large, many types of, bodies. You have the African Court of Justice, human rights bodies. You have this free trade zone. But then what we must see is that it also has had these grand proclamations. Continent has made these grand proclamations in 2013, which was the 50th year of the formation of AU. It announced the Agenda 2063. Now, if you look at Agenda 2063, just read them out because it shows the vision. That Agenda 2063, they have 7 aspirations. The first aspiration was a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Aspiration 2 was an integrated continent, politically united based on ideals of Pan-Africanism and vision of African Renaissance. Third is that an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice and rule of law. Fourth is a peaceful and a secure Africa. Fifth is an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values and ethics. Sixth aspiration was an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on potential of African people, especially its women, youth and caring for children. Seventh is Africa as a strong, united, resilient and influential global player and partner. Now, the point is that if you listen to these and if you look at the reality today, there's an enormous mismatch. There's a big dichotomy. And one of the reasons for this big dichotomy is that making this grand posturing has to also follow through with, actual changes on the ground. There was this agreement on silencing the gun by 2020. Now, we know 2020 is 5 years past and no guns have got silenced. So that's the point. Because the most important players are the states, and these states are in many ways weakened and compromised. And the third is that the people are not taken along. So you can make these grand designs, you can make these grand agendas, you can make the summit for the future and, for this. But eventually, the crux is in the pudding. I'm eating the pudding. The challenge is that how do you actually translate these aspirations, these values, or these desires and the agency. And this is where I would like to bring to focus is that what Professor Dubey also was saying about is that the agency which is responsible, the state, is itself in crisis in Africa. There was this wave of democracy, there was this hope that African states will be able to economically become relevant and but what we now find is that democracy is and conflicts are again endemic. Democracy, it's not across the continent, but there are cases where we find that economy, the democratic processes are weakened, are threatened, are at least being emasculated. So there is this one problem that the state itself is a challenge, and there are consequences of that. Take the case of failure of Somalian state, where loss of Somalian state was not only a consequence for the continent or the people of Somalia, but now we had an enormous global effort to manage the piracy which was caused because people in Somalia did not have meaningful ways to live their life and to have satisfactory good lives. So they were forced to pursue careers or activities which were there. Now you have in Sudan. Now just imagine that Sudan shares an enormously long border with the Red Sea, coast with the Red Sea. Now if tomorrow Sudanese state collapses and our people from transnational terrorist organizations or groups which are they can simply block the Red Sea far more effectively. They can block Port Jeddah or this Yambu, and you can imagine so much of oil which comes from there to us. So there is this point that the failure of states or crisis of states in any part of the system will have bearing on the whole system, and this in a very deeply entangled world, deeply engaged world is what you call worrying. Second thing, as Professor Dubey pointed out, that there are these transnational extremist movements like Boko Haram and all. And these are also largely because their emergence has largely been because the failure of the state or to failure of the developmental policies to make people feel that they are give people a satisfying and worthful life. Otherwise, people do take up various ways to express their disillusionment, and some of these disillusionment then get channelized through these sort of extremist organizations. We have this tragic experiences of migration into Fortress Europe, this illegal channel crossing at Gibraltar. So they have these various symptoms of the core crisis. So I think that eventually, as I was saying, that people do matter, states do matter, and these states have so it is both with the international system, the international relations, the contemporary world will have to in some way address these things, but at the same time create enabling conditions. But at the same time, the solutions to many of these African problems will have to emanate from within the continent, and solutions have to come from the people. They have to be people-centric. Now, how that happens, how it will happen is not for us to, it's normative issues, but the point is that it will have consequences. We cannot ignore those consequences, and as scholars of international relations, we cannot simply expect that 25% of the global, committee of states is going through various levels of crisis and not have a bearing on the larger international system. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moosa, for a very comprehensive historical run through African crisis, how international players have affected African countries, how African countries tried to cope with that. Very interesting presentation by him. Just to sum up the things that he said about resource curse, old scramble, new scramble, formation of regional organization, international powers intervention into that, and new non-state actors that are coming up, and how Africa fits into that. I think we are opening it for comments and question. A few things that I would like to say besides what I said initially. Why Africa matters, the first thing we should ask, who is asking this question? Is it academics like us? Then we have a very different answer. Or is it people of Africa who are asking it for themselves? Then they have a very different answers. And I suppose, as Professor Moosa suggested, that we are talking as a scholar. If we are discussing why Africa matters in international relation, it is important for us why it matters, because Africa has been one of the worst victims of international relations operation in the past, during the cold period, and even today. And when many countries have come out of that kind of colonial impact operation of international relation, Africa is still suffering. And as a student, we see that it has not come out. We also find there is tremendous difficulty in coming out of it. Just let me give a few examples. We know South Africa is one of the last to get independence. 1994 Constitution celebrated as one of the most progressive constitution, incorporating so many things which many other constitutions do not have. And see the comments of Trump. Why this comment? Because South African constitution is not a constitution which was given by its people according to their will. Those who are a student of African study, they would know that 13th principle that was negotiated between white and black government, within that South African constitution was to be made. To the extent South African constitution violates those agreements, South African constitution is null and void. It's a constitution of sovereign people giving to themselves a democratic setup. In that constitution, it was written that no private property will be nationalized. And that is part of the transfer of power between apartheid regime and democratic government. And if you violate that, you have all these people coming up. Who ensured that happens? As Professor Moosa was mentioning, today, a large number of Frank zone countries don't have central bank. They cannot issue their currency. They cannot devalue their currency. They cannot withdraw more than 25% of their own national earning from foreign exchange. Their bank remains in Paris. This is what Africa is suffering because of international relations. So we, as a student of African studies, we have to study Africa, how it matters in international relation, because it's so anachronistic in terms of a liberal regime that we talk about, in terms of egalitarian regime that we talk about, that even all the regional organizations that Professor Moosa mentioned, AU, ECOWAS, SADC, will collapse the day the external funding is withdrawn. 65% of external funding of AU is from outside sources. ECOWAS cannot survive if the France and other countries do not give funding for that. So why these regional organizations came up, who are supposed to collectively impact international relations in their favor, it is not happening because they were not meant to be that. They were supposed to be a handle through which international player will have their say in Africa. Even the African Union office was made by Chinese, and if you had seen the visuals when it was handed over to African country, a middle-level manager of an oil company gave the key like this to African Union president. This is what is happening there. Their entire rooms are bugged. Before they finish the meetings, the minutes are there in Mandarin in China. And this has been established. Africans are trying to come out of this, but the international forces and the configuration of international relations at this stage is such that despite their best interest, they are not able to come out of it. Why is it large number of Anglophone, Lusophone countries who were never part of Africa wants to join that skewed system or colonized system of Francophone? They are applying that, please make me member, though I am from Anglophone, though I am from Portuguese country, because they find the international relation and these important forces are governing Africa in a way that the regime is protected. their interests are protected. I am not going to give a lecture on this. All that I'm trying to say, that as a student, why Africa matters, we should look at that from a academic perspective, and why this victim of international relation is unable even today to come out of it, despite having 1.4 billion people, 55 countries, having all the resolve, the best brain resolve, but still they are subjected to AFRICOM, which has a clear mandate, which was established on the dismantling of Soviet NATO command to control Africa. It's clearly written to protect European American interest in Africa by AFRICOM. And it has displayed its strength in Sudan when it said either al-Bashir, you just give independence or fascist. It displayed its strength and clear participation in Libya. So how international relations matters to Africa even today is very important as a student. I'm not speaking on behalf of Africans. When they look at this, it matters very differently, but we are not looking at that. So I'll stop by making these few comments and invite other, yes, please.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation by Professor Moosa, and equally incisive comments by Professor Dubey, the chair. Since Professor Moosa referred to the Economist's cover stories as a marker of various trends in Africa, the January issue this year said that Africa really needs a capitalist revolution, that what it has got is the worst forms of the West and now Chinese state-sponsored capitalism, that over the last 20 years, from the promise of Africa, its per capita income has fallen from, in regional terms, from being the third worst off region in the world to the fourth worst off. And some of the biggest promising economies, Nigeria and South Africa, have done exceedingly poorly. And it suggested also that that Africa has fallen off the AI revolution and is not taking advantage. So this demographic dividend that we speak about may translate into a demographic nightmare. Moreover, that South Africa, for the reasons that both of you pointed out, Trump and his national security advisor Michael Waltz has identified it as one of those DIE countries, diversity, inclusion and equity, which for them is responsible for many of the ills of the world. And the fact that they brought out this sponsors of a resolution against Israel has further alienated them from the Trump administration. The Economist suggests, and again I'm not an expert on Africa, that even though China is the biggest bilateral trade partner of most of these countries and a source of great investment, China is also tapering off, it's cooling off. So where are the signs of hope in Africa? I'm just being contrarian and provocative, especially because we have senior figures from the diplomatic world here as well from Africa, but also addressing this question more academically to both of you.
Yes, please.
Mirror what the Dean said, a wonderful lecture by Professor Moosa and absolutely such insightful observations and comments by Professor Dubey. I actually also want to sort of, pick up this point that the Dean made about where are the signs of hope. Now, my personal knowledge of Africa is limited to one country, which is South Africa. But every time I go on a South African university campus, I'm just struck with the sheer brilliance and innovation and all that I see there. And South African university campuses are interesting because they're actually picking up some of the best intellectuals, scholars, and scientists from across Africa. So, if you actually look at their faculties, they're very Pan-African in their composition. And the students are also coming from all parts of Africa. Obviously, that's a very small sample size. It's very biased, the sample. But I'm actually amazed at the extent of sort of the energy, intellectual energy, and it's not just in sort of, the human and social sciences. I mean, in the hard sciences, in biotechnology, and
there's some really interesting sort of stuff happening in Africa. So I just wonder, is this probably the narrative that we are all collectively ignoring? And this again goes back to the demographic question and so on. Thank you.
Any other? Okay. Let's take Okay, please.
Sir, with the permission of Chair, can
Yes.
I ask you? Thank you, Professor Moosa and Sir Professor Ajay Dubey, for a excellent presentation on Africa's political development and geopolitical implications. But my question is, how do you fit India as a major power in the African continent?
No. See, hope is always eternal in the sense that we can search for it, and I'm sure if we look at it, and there are many examples also. I will not enumerate them, but take Mauritius for example. There are many other African countries which are very high in terms of quality of life, in terms of democratic processes, in terms of economic growth and development. There are
The economists only identify Ivory Coast and Rwanda as the
fastest growing. Yes.
Yeah.
No, but
Tiger.
and Rwanda is an interesting example because it also has come out from a genocide. It had a traumatic genocide in 1994. So despite a traumatic genocide, Rwanda has been among the fastest growing economies. It has been expansionist in some ways also. So it all brings us back to the original premise that the state is very important. If you have a very well organized, functional state with, a benevolent dictator at times. But the idea is that if the state is functional and the state functions properly and does the duty that are expected out of it, the chances of meaningful and far better life and hope will exist. The challenge is that because Africa is very vital in terms of other resources. Now see what is happening in DRC. It is the same Rwanda which is backing M23, and after the discovery, they made an announcement in Jan about discovering oil and gas in Lake Kivu. And then the next week you have this M23 moving on towards. So the resources are a curse, and the control and access of resources have the sheer force that comes. The most African states are unable to withstand that sort of pressure. Though that's the sad part of it. But then, as I said, that people do make themselves heard. Take the case of Sudan. You had a government, a military-inspired government and military-supported government, but eventually they were forced to concede, and some form of democratization was almost on, and eventually that collapsed, and now you have this country has been fragmented by the militia. The armed segment of the country itself has split into two. So there is these what do you call? We have to be hopeful, but at the same time there are these concerns and there are these worries. But the continent, as I told, is not just a sum total of crises, but there are many other green shoots that if you look at it, and if they get the opportunity in space, I'm sure they would make meaningful that. But the trouble, as Professor Dubey rightly pointed out, is that global forces won't allow that easily to happen. Unless the global forces themselves weaken, or they become undermined, or they get, like in the previous, there was contestations, so there's some form of balance of engagements or, intervention. Like during the Cold War, now we do find that presence of China did make a difference in terms of the prices, the commodities were happening. And that's why China was second scramble and, all that. But as Professor the Dean said, that China also is undergoing changes and crises or, issues. So how China engages, how China will engage, and how other... But the hope in the other is that the sheer number of players that have engaged Africa, Turkey, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, not only big powers or emerging powers, Brazil, Argentina. So there are a large number of new players who are engaging. So these larger number of new players actually will create counterbalances, which I hope will also allow the state some space to come up. With respect to India, India engages with Africa in multiple ways and it prioritizes it in fairly important, but at the same time, the optics are not very positive. The trouble is that we have not been able to organize the India-Africa Forum Summit since 2015. And this, whatever said and done, is a reflection on our foreign policy practitioners and in terms of the resistances which some African states have been posing in our engagement. So we will have to be far more proactive than we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Just to add that this issue of India not being able to organize the India-Africa Forum Summit, we have diplomats here from different countries, is something India should not be over-worried, in my opinion. For a simple reason that when first the Banjul formula under which India organized its first summit, India was the only country and is the only country in the world which accepted Banjul formula, where African Union will decide the money that a major partner from outside commits, how it is going to be spent, where it is going to be spent, and we did it the first summit. What happened? Countries with which we had no connections, the African Union decided to put it there. Project in which we have difficulty, they decided to do it there. The entire implementation of Banjul formula, all our important partners in Africa, who are also the major players in Africa, were out of it because those who framed African Union have framed in a way that the interest of the countries are overtaken by those interests which controls the African Union. And as I said, 65% of its funding comes from outside. And we have only said that we will extend Banjul formula, that not only 15 countries decided why African Union will participate, but all other countries will also be invited who are friends of India. This is not acceptable to African Union. They want India to meet only those countries, 15 countries which they decide in the summit. I don't think it's an acceptable propositions. And it's something we need to work on. Not a single country in the world has accepted this Banjul formula. Not China, not Japan, not Turkey, not European Union, not American. Why India accepted under Gurjit Singh is a different story, but maybe we can talk about that later on. Yes. Yes.
So, thank you. French influence in Africa, in the recent years it is being challenged. When we look the last 3-4 years, there are a series of military coups in Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali. And the countries are poised to move away from France. So my question is that they are rich in uranium and gold. In the last 3-4 years, how far they are successful in nationalizing the resource and claiming it back?
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation. I am Shantanu Bandyopadhyay from Center for South Asian Studies, SIS. Sir, I have to ask you about the Agenda 2063, which Moosa sir was pointing out. Agenda 2063 has some few flagship events, like the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was launched. And there were other things like silencing guns by 2030. There were other things like Pan-African passport and African high-speed rail network. So I want to get your perspective that whether we are anywhere close to even achieving this objective and targets which were in the Agenda 2063.
Fair enough. Take it. See.
Any other question? Yeah. Yes, please.
I am Bishrit Das, PhD second year, Center for West Asian Studies. My question is tribalism still a dominant factor behind the state formation of Africa, or whether it become the imitation of the Westphalian order?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning, the speaker. This lecture was very insightful. And my question is, first of all, I should introduce myself. I'm Ritika Singh from SIS, and my question is regarding the take you have told, in Africa, everything is about mineral resources and strategic resources. So, in this view, international relations are being a curse to Africa, and international partners are already trying to capture those resources. So, how Africa is navigating through the climate change burden, which is addition to that resource problem? Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. It was indeed an enlightening lecture. My name is Aman. I'm from Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. I'm doing PhD. So my question is with Professor Moosa. So, Professor, earlier in your lecture, you mentioned, in the early part of your lecture, you mentioned and highlight that how African's continent public image is often, portrayed as marginalized, and you also gave a reference to the magazine, The Economist magazine. So, I wanted to ask you the question in this particular respect, given the growing importance of strategic narratives in shaping global perceptions, how are African nations leveraging the social media and other digital platforms, particularly in the context of growing importance of AI, to assert control over their narratives? Are there specific strategies or initiatives aimed at countering dominant Western portrayals, and how effective have they been in reshaping discourse about Africa? It would be little helpful if you answer this question in respect to South Africa and Nigeria. Thank you.
Please.
There is paucity of time, but anyway, I'll just see the French. So we have a few minutes. So in terms of uranium, in terms of gold or other, these are resources which require to be mined properly. Then you need orderly, systems in place to ensure that these are properly mined, properly transferred, and then transported, and then and their returns and are brought back. So financial benefits come to the state concerned. So these are, as I said, that they were established structures, and they are now being undermined slowly by emergence of Russian in some places and others. So the idea is that these don't change immediately in short term, but there is a difference. Like in the case of uranium, it was said that market rate was at almost 200 times what the French were paying. So that's the the sort of control that was there. So obviously French won't easily go, and it will not be easy for the African states to also easily disengage. So, but there is a process. That's the important point, that there is this unraveling happening. Second thing is that, as I told you, that even silencing the gun, the initial target was 2020. So the achievements are in terms of implementation. African continental bodies have not been so effective in terms of implementing their own claims, or their own desires and aspirations. So in the same way, Agenda 2063, as I read them out, are also going to be a challenge in terms of how they will be able to attain them. It will be not easy. It is a big struggle, and it is going to be navigated through these contestations, and still looks very difficult. It doesn't look very easy to achieve, and may not be able to achieve all of them as they want. Even 2030, silencing the gun is going to look very difficult, given the crisis that is permanent. African states were not tribal, in the sense that neither communities did not have a say in the boundaries of their boundary states. So they are multi-communities, multi-tribal or multi-ethnic group states, and that is one of the problems, is that these states are artificial boundaries, and by European intervention. So that's the challenge. It's a climate change. Obviously, there are consequences of climate change which have to be mitigated. There have to be adaptations, and this again brings us back to the question of the agency which is supposed to do it. Then the agency, apart from individual communities and groups, it has to be the state, and that's where the challenge to the state is even more, because sometimes the consequences are very dramatic, and they are significant, famine, food shortages. So We do need states which are robust enough to respond to that. So as the Dean pointed out, in terms of AI and other social media, there is the report that says that they are not leveraging it as they should and as they should effectively be able to do. And that's because largely, again, it boils down to what I was saying, states do matter. That the agencies which have to be used have to have an agenda for pushing their image, pushing their narratives, pushing what they wish, and sometimes they may not be as effective. They may be dicey functional. So that's one of the reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Africa in this program. Thank you so much.